My name is Laya Goodal,
I'm Samuel Loch.
And I'm Elias Tymas.
and we had the bubonic plague as our pandemic presentation. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, so when and where did this plague actually occur? And this plague occurred in the mid-1300s, specifically the years 1346 to 1352 was known as the Great Dying or the Black Death, as we so commonly hear of, because it's a very famous pandemic. It's one of the first of mass casualty. And this pandemic specifically traveled to Europe and Northern Africa from Central Asia, it was believed by many scholars. It's pretty agreed upon. And it traveled through the ancient trade route called the Silk Route. And this route was responsible for trading ideas, goods, services, but also diseases. And the bubonic plague is a notable one. And as I said, it spread all throughout Europe and parts of Northern Africa as well. As you can see from the map, we have different years that the bubonic plague actually reached these different areas. So for example, the yellow at the top is around 1352, while the purple and the red are around 1347, 1348. So it gives you a good idea of how exactly the plague spread throughout Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, so how did this exactly spread from person to person? Was it fleas to rats to humans? Rats to fleas to humans? So initially, this plague was believed to be exclusively spread from infected fleas transmitting the diseases to rats to humans, at least by scholars in recent times, not back then. There was many theories and conspiracies on how exactly this plague was spread, but scholars for a long time agreed that this was rats to fleas to humans, and it was by the Y. pestis bacteria, which is a gram-negative bacteria, and what that means is that the cell wall is extra thick, and it makes it more deadly because it's harder to get rid of and it's harder to fight. So for example, a gram-negative bacteria would be something like cholera or E. coli, something very deadly, very sickening. And current research shows that this plague was most likely spread not only from rats to fleas to humans, and then spread by fleas throughout then, but it was also most likely spread by aerosol from human to human without the addition of fleas or rats in living conditions. And this is suspected because of the low flea activity that happens during winter. And because of this, the fleas would not be as rampant and therefore the disease will not spread as much, but this was simply not true. The disease was rampant for these years. And this made quarantine not as effective because when they would quarantine a household who had someone sick, the whole household would possibly die from this disease. And it was believed to be through aerosol. Next slide, please. So how deadly was this disease and who did it exactly affect? The disease was characteristically named the Black Death from the buboes, which were swellings on the lymph nodes on your neck and the groin area. And these were big black swellings and they would continue to swell until they burst, if you were lucky to make it that long, because they also were accompanied by high fevers. And then if they were to burst, oftentimes the person who was infected would go through septic shock because the infection would leak into their bloodstream. And 1346 to 1352 was a time that roughly 20 million people died. It was very traumatic for Europe, and it was fatal for 70 to 80% of these cases. The fatality rate was very high. And 30 to 50% of the European population died from this plague. It was very detrimental to the economy and families. And it was a selective killer like many diseases, and there was a decreased mortality when you were in good health. But this plague, like I said, was extremely deadly and killed of all ages and health conditions. Next slide, please.
So all this death is going on all throughout Europe, and the people at the time wanted to put an end to it, obviously. But a problem was that they didn't know very much about diseases or how they spread or how to prevent them. So what we get then is a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of myths, and ultimately a lot of scapegoating of Jewish populations and minority populations. They believe that, or many believe that it was the Jewish population that was spreading this disease and that caused this disease. And as a response to that, many kingdoms and cities would persecute Jewish populations and expel them from their cities. Now, an interesting paper I found went into this sort of expulsions of Jewish and minority populations, but what they found was that as disease outcomes became worse, communities were less likely to expel Jewish and minority populations. As we can see in the graph in the upper right, we see mortality rate increasing, and as mortality rate increases from the left to the right, we see the amount of persecutions going down. So the paper gives multiple different reasons for this. One of the reasons that they give for this is that perhaps when everyone is dying from the disease, there's not enough sort of social energy to institute these expulsions. They also looked at sort of the economic impact that different Jewish communities had during the Black Death, and if there was a city that had a particularly strong Jewish community, then they were also less likely to be expelled from the city. So these expulsions went on for many years, and it is believed that they were ended by Pope Clement VI. He gave out a statement where he said, "It cannot be true that the Jews are the cause or occasion of the plague, because throughout many parts of the world, the same plague, by the hidden judgment of God, has afflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves." The argument he's making there is that, well, Jewish people are getting sick, just like everybody else, so it's unlikely that it's the cause of the Jewish people. And after this, we do actually see a drop in the amount of persecutions of particularly Jewish populations. But this was all for the first wave of the plague. And there were many waves of the plague, as we heard about before. And in the second wave, cities sort of had a better idea of how to deal with it. So some cities like Venice instituted quarantines. They started at 30 days, but eventually grew to 40 days, which is where the word quarantine comes from. Now, as we heard, these quarantines weren't always the most effective thing and would often end in the family that was quarantined all dying together, but perhaps then less disease was spread throughout the entire city. So we see these quarantines start popping up during the second wave as more of an effective response to the pandemic. As for fiscal policy, we see that the Catholic Church allowed people to stop tithing if they requested. The Catholic Church obviously likes Catholics to tithe, give 10% of their income to the church. And during this period, people could request to the Pope or to their clergy that they don't have the ability to tithe. And this sort of took pressure off of local communities, people that didn't make a lot of money and people that were being hit the hardest by the plague. The understanding is that the church's goal was not to tax people, but instead was to provide aid and help cities regrow after a large amount of death from this pandemic.
So there were many disparate impacts, economic impacts across Europe and the rest of the world. But one that needs to be highlighted is that wages were raised for laborers. We saw that across Europe as 40% of the working population died. And we saw diets improve accordingly, that the strength of those improvements varied across Europe. But we did see, at least in the short term, rises in wages for laborers. This problem of labor, however, that there was this huge shortage of labor, did lead many noble lords to institute things like price controls, compulsory work orders. We saw those in England, as well as forfeited wages, and going back to the point about Jewish persecution, we did see that lower mortality cities that persecuted their Jewish populations had a negative effect on their growth. That it was not always a huge major, but we did see an effect. Next slide, please. And over the long term, as one thing that needs to be pointed out is institutions have effects on, and things like plagues can affect the strength and quality and of different countries and different nations' institutions. Western laborers in Western Europe won growth-driving freedoms and were able to and saw economic benefits as a result of that. They saw growth over the period after the pandemic. In this chart right here, you can see in Germanic-speaking cities during the period of the pandemic, Western countries, there was a sharp increase in growth after the period of the pandemic, and they still experienced growth during. However, in the East, we did see where there were more individualized farming practices and laborers were less able to bargain efficiently and collectively with one another with their feudal lords. We saw actually subjugation and what Darren Acemoglu in one paper, and along with Johnson Robinson, saw as a renewal of serfdom. And we can see in this graph that we actually saw a decrease in and a lull in urban construction during that period after the pandemic, and that lasted. Those impacts lasted for several centuries after we saw and obviously there were many economic events that had transpired across those centuries, but this was a major event that really impacted the trajectories of Eastern and Western Europe collectively. And it does help explain just in general how labor mobility in Western Europe was essential to the increase in fortunes of laborers at the time.